They lived at the edge of the city, banned from taverns, hated by all. Yet without them, medieval towns would have drowned in their own filth. These were the toilet cleaners of the Middle Ages. With every breath they took, they risked dying. But it was thanks to them that humanity did not die in its own waste. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, its public health systems, vast, brilliant, and centuries ahead of their time, collapsed with it. Aqueducts that once carried fresh water over mountains and valleys were left to dry and crumble. The cloacae, Rome's vast subterranean sewers, choked with rubble. Public latrines sat abandoned or repurposed, their flowing waters stilled. What had once been a civilization engineered to flush away human waste was replaced by cities that let it rot underfoot. As Europe fractured into feudal kingdoms, no one rebuilt what had been lost. New towns emerged without plans, rules, or even memory. Streets were laid wherever feet wandered, houses pressed against each other in crooked rows, and nowhere, neither in royal charters nor church decrees, did sanitation appear. When waste needed to go, it was flung into the street, poured into shallow ditches, or dumped into rivers already reeking of decay. People lived among layers of refuse. Chamber pots were emptied from windows. Fish guts, butcher's blood, spoiled meat, dead cats, all of it tossed where it fell. Rain turned alleys into foul rivers. Straw was thrown down to hide the filth, not clean it. Over time, streets rose higher, not from construction, but from the slow burial of centuries of rotting debris. Doors were bricked shut and windows raised. Some medieval cities today are perched a meter above their original Roman foundations, entire generations literally walking on waste. The stench was overwhelming. In summer, the air grew thick with heat and rot. It crept into homes, seeped into clothing, clung to hair. And though medieval people lacked the concept of microbes, they feared what they called miasma, bad air, rising from decay. They believed this foul vapor caused sickness and death. It was a flawed theory, but not entirely wrong. Disease did rise from the filth, just not in the way they understood. To protect themselves, people burned herbs and sweet-smelling resins. Nobles carried pomanders filled with spices. Vinegar was poured near thresholds. Priests swung censers heavy with incense, but the stench always returned. What they could not see, bacteria in tainted water, on hands, in food, was what truly sickened them. The air was a symptom, not the source. By the 12th century, medieval cities were growing fast, and the sheer volume of waste was staggering. A town of 10,000 people could generate over 4,000 kilograms of excrement every single day, on top of every other form of organic and industrial waste. And with no system to remove it, it simply stayed, festering. Some cities attempted regulation. In Prague, a law passed in 1407 banned tossing waste from windows. In Paris, street sweepers were hired, but their carts often dumped loads just outside the walls. In Edinburgh, people shouted, "Gardy-loo!" before throwing night soil from their homes, a courtesy that did little to protect the unlucky. In reality, these measures were token gestures. Waste disposal remained the responsibility of no one in particular. In the countryside, it was no better. Villagers dug shallow pits that overflowed when it rained. Latrines stood near wells. Children played beside open sewage. Entire communities drank from streams poisoned upstream by their own neighbors. Typhoid, dysentery, intestinal worms. These were not rare afflictions. They were a way of life. Even monasteries, famed for discipline and order, suffered. While Cistercians preserved fragments of Roman sanitation and used running water to divert waste, most monks relieved themselves in communal pits or rudimentary latrines shared by dozens. Infections spread quickly through unwashed robes and shared tools. Cleanliness may have been next to godliness, but even in sacred spaces, rot found a home. What had once been a science became a distant legend. Without the knowledge, resources, or urgency to rebuild sanitation systems, Europe simply adapted to the filth. Cities rose, diseases followed, and death came quietly, on breath, in water, beneath bare feet. And when waste overflowed from cesspits and flooded alleys, someone, eventually, had to climb down and remove it by hand. That someone stood lower than a beggar, slept outside city gates, and breathed the fumes no one else dared to inhale. The medieval toilet cleaner. By the time medieval cities reached their peak in the 13th and 14th centuries, they had grown into dense, churning hives of human activity, markets teeming with voices, church bells echoing over rooftops, carts rattling down alleys barely wide enough for a man to pass. But beneath that noise and movement was something far more sinister, a near-total absence of sustainable waste management. Europe's new urban populations had learned to live without sewers, without running water, without any consistent way to rid themselves of the biological byproducts of daily life. Instead, they dug pits. The most common form of waste disposal in the medieval period was the cesspit, a deep hole dug into the earth behind homes or beneath courtyards, sometimes crudely lined with timber or stone, often left open to the soil. Into these pits went everything: urine, feces, kitchen waste, animal offal, blood, bones, spoiled beer, and whatever else could not be used, burned, or fed to pigs. These holes were expected to absorb it all quietly, invisibly, and eternally. But they never did. They filled, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once, and when they did, they threatened to seep back into homes through the very floorboards meant to keep families safe. In poorer districts, no cesspits existed at all. Instead, there were shared latrines, tiny wooden shacks with holes over the earth, reeking of ammonia and rot, rarely cleaned and never maintained. Some cities offered public privies, often located near rivers or in secluded alleys, but these were few and far between. In practice, the most common toilet was a bucket in the corner of a room, emptied not by servants or city workers, but by whoever had the misfortune of drawing the short straw. When that bucket overflowed, its contents were flung into the street or gutter, joining the slow, glistening trickle of waste that wound through every district. Castles had their own form of convenience. Stone-built privy towers known as garderobes, which jutted out from the walls and funneled waste down a vertical shaft into the moat, or a pit below. While it allowed lords and nobles a sense of privacy, the smell was no less foul, and the waste merely shifted location. Moats around castles were not clean defensive structures. They were dark, stagnant, bubbling with years of excrement. In summer, they steamed. In winter, they froze over into solid slabs of brownish ice. Birds landed there only once. In wealthier homes and monasteries, especially in the Low Countries and Italy, some ingenuity persisted. There were examples of privies connected by angled chutes to flowing water, where streams or man-made channels carried the waste away. Cistercian monks were known for their clean cloisters and reredouters, latrine buildings built directly over small rivers or aqueduct-fed channels. But these were the rare exception, not the rule. The vast majority of Europe's towns and villages had no such luxury. Waste stayed close to where it was made. Even where natural drainage existed, rivers, tidal estuaries, or ditches, it was quickly overwhelmed. Cities dumped everything into these waterways, not just human waste, but tannery chemicals, slaughterhouse blood, textile dyes, and the carcasses of dogs and horses. In London, the Fleet River was once clean enough to fish in. By the 14th century, it had turned into a black, oozing sewer, its surface bubbling with methane and slime. In Paris, the Seine served both as a source of drinking water and a dumping ground. People filled jugs at one bend and emptied chamber pots at the next. Cholera and typhoid did not travel by air. They floated downstream. Open ditches cut into the ground were a common feature in many towns. These channels, intended to carry away rainwater, were quickly repurposed into open sewers. But unlike Rome's cloacae, these medieval drains were exposed, shallow, and easily clogged. A single dead animal or pile of offal could block the entire system. When that happened, the ditch turned into a stagnant pool, swarming with flies, breeding worms, and releasing fumes so acrid they made eyes water from meters away. In summer, the stench was unbearable. In winter, the frozen crust trapped the rot below, only to thaw again in spring and release a new wave of sickness into the air. None of this was hidden. Everyone lived with it. Nobles, merchants, priests, beggars. Waste was not something removed or purified. It was something endured. Children grew up playing beside cesspits. Markets were held next to ditches. Lovers walked past heaps of excrement without comment. People washed their hands in the same streams that carried waste from upstream neighbors. The line between clean and dirty simply did not exist in the modern sense. Dirt was not the exception. It was the norm. And when a cesspit filled, it did not empty itself. It rotted through the floorboards and stained the walls. Some families, too poor or indifferent to dig a new one, simply built another pit beside the old. Others bricked up the overflowing shaft and began tossing their waste into nearby streets or alleys, pretending the problem no longer existed. Occasionally, the buildup grew too great to ignore. Water from wells began to smell. Rats multiplied in terrifying numbers. The scent became so intense that even those who had lived with it their entire lives began to gag. That was when someone was called. A man with a rope, a long-handled scoop, and a stomach strong enough to descend into a hole no one else dared to enter. He would come at night, carrying a lamp and a wooden cart, and begin to empty the rot that had accumulated not for days, but for years. And what he faced was not just filth, it was danger. For in the medieval world, there were few places darker, more putrid, or more deadly than the bottom of a forgotten cesspit. No one volunteered to do it. No child grew up dreaming of it. And yet, every city needed them. Those nameless, reeking men who climbed into the bowels of the earth and returned, if they were lucky, gasping for air and soaked to the bone in humanity's worst. They were known by many names: gong farmers in England, quat furers in parts of Central Europe, vidangeurs in France. In Latin, they were sometimes referred to simply as latrinarius, a man of the latrine. They were called when the smell was no longer tolerable, when the waste threatened to rise above the floorboards, when the air in a courtyard choked even the toughest blacksmith, and when the bucket no longer sufficed, and the pit below had transformed from a hole into a swollen, breathing thing. Someone had to descend, always at night, always alone or with a small, equally desperate crew. Never in daylight, when others could see them and cover their faces in disgust. They were, almost without exception, men of the lowest standing. Many were ex-criminals, outcasts, debtors who could find no other way to survive. Some were part of the executioner's extended circle, a profession already tainted with spiritual uncleanliness. Others were simply born into the role, inheriting the stench and the shame from fathers too poor or too broken to give them any other life. They lived on the fringes, literally cast outside city walls, confined to slums where the scent of the pit might not offend more respectable noses. They could not enter taverns. They could not attend church services during Mass. Some were forbidden from marrying within city limits. In many towns, their very touch was believed to carry moral filth. Children whispered about them. Women crossed themselves as they passed. But still, they worked, because the alternative was worse. Let the cesspits go uncleared, and sickness would flood every corner of the town. They were hated, but needed. Their tools were simple but specific. A wooden pole with a wide iron scoop at the end, sometimes forked, sometimes curved like a ladle. Buckets reinforced with metal hoops to withstand the corrosive weight of long-stored waste. Ropes and pulleys to haul the heavy barrels out of deep shafts. Oil lamps mounted on hooks or carried in one hand, flickering weakly against the choking darkness. Some carried cloth soaked in vinegar or spirits, stuffed into nostrils to blunt the smell. Most found it didn't help. They often stripped down to underclothes or wore patched, ruined tunics smeared with lard to keep the waste from soaking in too quickly. There were no gloves, no boots thick enough. Their hands bled from splinters, their feet cracked from constant damp. Each movement was slow, deliberate. One misstep in the pitch-black hole could mean a fall into depths too foul to survive. They lowered themselves with care into the cesspits, sometimes several meters deep, standing ankle or knee-deep in decades of human filth. Some pits had hardened layers at the top, black, dry crusts that had to be broken apart with poles before the softer, rotting sludge below could be lifted. It was thick, tar-like, full of bones, stones, rags, and maggots. The stench was not just strong. It was suffocating, a weight that pressed against the chest and turned the stomach. More than one man fainted at the bottom and never woke again. The job was not quick. Removing the contents of a single large cesspit could take days. The waste had to be shoveled into barrels, hauled up one at a time, loaded onto wooden carts lined with straw, and wheeled to the outskirts of town, where it was dumped in designated fields, if such fields existed. In many cases, it was simply poured into rivers downstream of the nearest village or left in marshes where no one dared to build. Sometimes, these same fields were used to fertilize crops. In rare moments of bitter irony, the same peasants who threw refuse into the pit might later eat cabbage grown in its leavings. Gong farmers were required by law to work only at night, partly to avoid public offense, partly to reduce the spread of stench during the day. The penalty for violating this curfew could be severe. In some towns, it was a beating. In others, imprisonment. Still, their presence was sometimes tolerated just enough to allow them to operate inside the walls, so long as they did so invisibly. They moved like ghosts through alleyways, their carts creaking over cobblestones, the liquid slosh of waste marking their slow, grim procession. In larger cities, the work was often organized under guild-like systems, with a foreman or master responsible for assigning jobs and routes. These were the rare few who had earned something close to respect, men who had survived long enough, paid the right bribes, and built a reputation for reliability. They negotiated contracts with city councils, ensured that cesspits near hospitals or monasteries were prioritized, and collected payment when it was actually given. But most toilet cleaners were day laborers. If they didn't show up, no one searched for them. If they vanished into the pit, there were no funerals. Only a new man, hungrier or more desperate than the last, willing to take their place. They aged quickly, their teeth blackened. Some carried the stench to their graves. Others never made it that far. This was the price of a city's comfort. For every bedpan emptied, every street that didn't flood with filth, there was a man who had bent over a pit in the dark, waist-deep in rot, shoveling it away by the bucket. The work of a medieval toilet cleaner was not just foul, it was lethal. To descend into a cesspit was to step into an invisible battlefield where the enemy was not man, but rot, gas, disease, darkness, and the unpredictable treachery of time-rotted wood. Every night's labor came with the knowledge that one misjudged breath or misplaced foot could end your life in the most humiliating way imaginable, buried alive beneath centuries of human waste. They worked in darkness so thick it seemed to have weight. Oil lamps sputtered and flickered, their flames dimmed by damp, their light swallowed by the walls of the pit. One could not see more than an arm's length in any direction. The earth around them was silent except for the creak of rope, the drip of waste from the ceiling, and the sloshing sound of filth shifting beneath their feet. They moved slowly, not out of fear, but necessity. A fall here did not mean broken bones. It meant drowning in muck that would never give you back. The air was worse than the sludge. Methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, all invisible, all deadly. The deeper the pit, the more dangerous the breath. In poorly ventilated cesspits, a single exhale might be your last. The gases pooled at the bottom, displacing oxygen and lulling the body into drowsiness before suffocating it entirely. Some cleaners carried lit candles as primitive warning devices. If the flame went out, so would they. But often, there was no time. Men would simply slump forward mid-task, overcome by the vapor, and disappear into the murk. And then there were the accidents. Latrines and cesspits were not built to last, nor were they meant to be re-entered. Their wooden beams decayed invisibly over time, softened by moisture, gnawed by rats, or rotted from the inside by centuries of acid fumes. One wrong step on a floorboard above could mean the collapse of an entire structure. Entire families were known to vanish through their own privy floor, swallowed by the pit beneath. For the cleaners, who climbed into these death traps willingly, the risk was far higher. The most infamous disaster of all occurred in 1184 in Erfurt, Germany, where dozens of nobles, gathered for an imperial meeting, were seated above a large stone latrine in the bishop's palace. The floor collapsed without warning, and over 60 men plummeted into the cesspit below. Many drowned. Others were crushed by falling beams and bodies. The incident became a grim legend across Europe. But what was rare for nobles was tragically common for the poor. Hundreds of toilet cleaners met similar ends in silence, their names never written, their stories never told. Some fell not through sudden collapse, but by slow miscalculation. A slippery rung on a rope ladder. A bucket breaking loose and striking the man below. A moment's loss of balance in the pitch black. Some pits were deep enough to kill from the fall alone. Others were shallow, but thick enough to trap. Once submerged in semi-liquid waste, limbs became useless. The body panicked, flailed, sucked in toxic sludge, and was gone. The only recovery was the dreadful task of retrieving the corpse, which often fell to the next cleaner, working side by side with death, scraping it from the bottom with a hooked pole. Even those who survived the pits were slowly destroyed by them. The skin on their feet cracked and bled. Open wounds never healed. Their lungs burned from breathing the fumes. The constant exposure to rotting matter caused chronic infections. Cuts from iron tools festered into abscesses. Their joints swelled, their backs curved, their hands became stiff and calloused. Many suffered from what we would now call chemical burns. Raw, blistered flesh eaten away by the toxic slurry they stood in night after night. The smell itself was an enemy. It clung to the skin, soaked into hair, seeped into the breath. No amount of washing could remove it entirely. It haunted their sleep, followed them into daylight. Others could smell it before they were seen, on their clothing, in their sweat. There are accounts of innkeepers refusing even to rent rooms to these men, not out of cruelty, but because the smell would linger in the walls and floorboards for weeks after they left. Some cleaners developed psychological symptoms, aversion to light, nervous tics, hallucinations triggered by the constant fumes and isolation. They suffered from heat stroke in summer, hypothermia in winter, and the constant threat of rats, huge, disease-ridden beasts that nested in cesspits and sometimes attacked workers if cornered. In cities near rivers, leeches bred in the wet earth and latched onto exposed skin. Flies covered their faces. Mosquitoes bred in still pools and carried fevers with them. And always there was the silence. The lonely, unbearable quiet of being the only man alive at the bottom of a pit. No one called down to check. No one asked if you were all right. You worked until the barrel filled. Then you shouted for it to be hauled up. If your voice failed, if your rope snapped, if your lamp died, you were left behind. Buried not in honor, but in the rot of a world that refused to remember your name. The irony, of course, was cruel. The lives of thousands depended on these men, and yet their own lives were considered worthless. They cleaned what no one else would touch, suffered what no one else could bear, and died deaths that made others turn away in revulsion. Their labor was invisible, until it wasn't, until the pit cracked, until the smell crawled through the streets like a warning. The body of a toilet cleaner was a battlefield. Not in the heroic sense. No banners flew, no medals were awarded. But in the quiet, invisible way that constant exposure to rot, disease, and poison wages wore on skin, lungs, blood, and mind. Their suffering was not sudden, like a sword wound or fall from a ladder. It was slow, gnawing, unrelenting. Every shift into the pit took something from them. A breath, a patch of skin, a fragment of sanity. Their bodies decayed in life. The most immediate threat came from infection. Their hands and feet were in constant contact with waste, raw, festering, swarming with bacteria centuries before anyone knew what bacteria were. A single nick from a rusty scoop or splintered bucket could open the door to agony. Wounds that might heal in a day on a clean farm swelled and rotted in the cesspit. Cuts turned black. Pus filled the flesh. Some men lost fingers. Others developed ulcers that split their feet open to the bone. There was no antiseptic, no antibiotics, only bandages, prayer, and pain. Then there were the rashes. Working waist-deep in slurry for hours left skin raw and blistered. Constant moisture and ammonia burns inflamed the thighs, groin, and underarms. Some cleaners developed permanent scabs, dry, flaking scars that never healed, cracking open again with each new shift. The stench of their own infected skin blended with the surrounding filth until it became indistinguishable. Even their breath began to smell of the pit. It was as though their bodies had begun to rot from the outside in. Their lungs fared no better. The fumes of decomposing waste filled every breath. Methane, sulfur, ammonia, the vapor of rot itself. Breathing was an act of endurance. Coughing became normal. But over time, that cough grew deeper, wetter. Men wheezed in their sleep. They spat black phlegm into gutters. Some died coughing, curled in corners with chests too full to breathe. No one could say what the disease was. Lung fever, corruption of the humors, punishment for sin. But it followed the cleaners like a shadow. And still they returned. Night after night, down into the pit, because there was no other work that paid, and no other path open to men already marked by filth. Yet as brutal as the physical toll was, the social punishment was crueler still. In the medieval world, purity was not just physical, it was spiritual. Cleanliness was seen as a sign of godliness, and filth a reflection of moral decay. To handle excrement daily was not merely disgusting, it was defiling. The toilet cleaner did not just carry waste on his hands, he carried sin in the eyes of his neighbors. Some cities passed laws forbidding them to walk through markets during daylight hours. Others pushed them to the very edge of town, where their homes clung to the margins like discarded husks. Even there, they were often segregated, forced to live in their own quarters, surrounded by others who shared the same stink, the same exile. These neighborhoods were considered cursed. Few dared visit them. Children were told not to play nearby. If a house caught fire, the city might not bother to send help. They were also excluded from rituals of community. Their children were sometimes denied baptism. Their marriages were often unblessed by clergy. They buried their dead in silence, in unmarked graves, without procession or prayer. The assumption was simple. A man who cleaned excrement had defiled himself so completely that even God might turn away. There was no cleansing from their work. No matter how many times they bathed in rivers, no matter how much lye they scrubbed into their skin, the stench remained. It soaked into pores. It settled beneath fingernails. It clung to the back of the throat and reappeared in every exhale. Some cleaners lost the ability to smell it altogether, a mercy perhaps. But everyone else could. The reaction was automatic. People stepped away, turned their heads, pinched their noses. Sometimes they spit in the street as the men passed. And this rejection bred something harder than pain: silence. Cleaners learned not to speak unless spoken to. They avoided eye contact. They delivered their bills to city officials with heads bowed. Even among themselves, conversation was sparse. They became shadows, present but invisible, vital but despised. The world they moved through was one of doorways closed too fast, streets crossed too suddenly, hands wiped on aprons as though their presence was a stain. In some regions, they were treated little better than lepers. In others, worse, because leprosy was seen as a divine punishment, while a toilet cleaner had chosen his path. The punishment, in the eyes of the community, was deserved. Even their own families could not escape the stigma. A son born to a cleaner might find no one willing to apprentice him. A daughter might be unmarriageable, no matter how clean her hands or kind her heart. The trade marked not just the man, but his bloodline. For all their isolation and humiliation, Medieval toilet cleaners occupied a strange place in the economic landscape of the city, reviled in public, yet relied upon in secret, barred from community life, yet quietly compensated behind closed doors. They were reminders of what society refused to acknowledge, but they were also men who could, on certain nights, earn in a few hours what many artisans struggled to make in a week. The cities could not function without them. Privies filled, cesspits overflowed, and moats blackened until the stench of human waste seeped through the foundations of noble homes and monastery walls. At some point, the filth had to be dealt with. And since no one else would touch it, those who dared to descend into the rot found themselves, despite their stigma, in a position of unique bargaining power. They named their price, and cities paid, grudgingly but consistently. In 14th century London, a gong farmer might earn up to 6 pence a night, a sum equivalent to a week's wages for a stonemason. In parts of France and the Low Countries, municipal records reveal that skilled cleaners were contracted annually by city councils and paid stipends, room allowances, and in some cases, the right to collect compostable waste for resale as fertilizer. It was a grim privilege, but a profitable one. In an economy where most families scraped by on a few coins a week, the cleaners, at least for a time, could afford bread, meat, and even drink, though taverns refused to serve them unless they paid up front and left quickly. But this uneasy prosperity came with strict limitations. Cities were terrified of what happened when waste was disturbed at the wrong time or in the wrong place. The smell, the spread of disease, the panic of citizens waking to find open cesspits in the street, all of it had to be avoided at all costs. And so, medieval city councils imposed tight regulations on when and where toilet cleaners could operate. In London, they were forbidden to work by day. All cleaning had to be done after sunset and completed by dawn. The movement of waste carts through city streets was permitted only under curfew, with strict routes mapped out by city clerks. A cleaner found violating these rules could be fined, imprisoned, or, more often, whipped in public as a warning to others. It was not just about the filth. It was about visibility. The city could tolerate its own waste, but not the sight of its removal. In many cities, waste disposal became a matter of contract. Cleaners were required to submit bids for large cesspit jobs, especially in monasteries, hospitals, and guild halls. Winning such contracts could mean a small fortune, but also months of brutal, continuous work. Larger cesspits might require entire crews, organized into hierarchies not unlike those of the building trades. There were masters and foremen, apprentices and day laborers. The most experienced managed the tools and negotiated pay. The newest hires did the crawling. Sometimes, the city itself oversaw cesspit clearance. In Paris, for example, a sanitation board existed by the 15th century, maintaining records of public latrine cleanings and scheduling regular pit removals in densely populated quarters. But these were rare cases. Most sanitation work was piecemeal, organized ad hoc, often paid in silver coins delivered in wax-sealed pouches to avoid direct hand contact. In smaller towns, a single cleaner might be responsible for every cesspit inside the walls, operating entirely alone with no oversight or protection. They were also held responsible for the safe disposal of the waste they removed. Dumping within city walls was illegal, and cleaners had to haul their barrels to designated dumping grounds, often several miles outside the town perimeter. These areas were euphemistically referred to as night soil fields, or waste meadows. In practice, they were reeking pits surrounded by flies and visited only under moonlight. The journey itself was dangerous. Bandits, wild dogs, drunken watchmen. If a barrel spilled en route, it could spark a public outrage. If it leaked into a stream or pond, the fines could bankrupt a man. Some cities enforced inspections. Carts had to be covered in animal hides or cloth. Barrels were inspected for leaks. Ropes were checked. In German cities like Nuremberg and Cologne, official records show cleaners summoned before magistrates for endangering public health by failing to properly secure their loads. The same courts that paid them also punished them, and no cleaner could ever be fully certain whether he'd return from a job with coins or chains. And yet, for all this regulation and scrutiny, the cleaners endured. While artisans begged and priests prayed and farmers starved, the cleaner climbed back down into the hole and came up with just enough silver to keep going. Still, the money never bought them respect. If anything, it made their isolation worse. To be poor and filthy was pitied. To be filthy and well-paid was hated. Envy soured what little tolerance might have remained. Rumors spread of cleaners hiding gold in cesspits, of poisoning wells to drive up demand, of trafficking in sin and disease. In truth, most spent their coin on survival, food, medicine, warm clothes. But gossip stuck like the stench they carried. In the end, theirs was a profession trapped between necessity and rejection. Cities needed them, but never honored them. Councils paid them, but watched them like criminals. In the aftermath of the Great Plagues, city officials in some regions began taking sanitation more seriously, not out of sympathy for cleaners, but out of panic for their own lives. The late 14th and 15th centuries saw a rise in urban regulations concerning waste disposal, particularly in wealthier or trade-heavy regions where dense populations demanded tighter control. Municipal boards were created. Night soil routes were mapped. Fines were levied for those who dumped waste outside approved locations. Cities began to look outward, not to moralists or monks, but to those who could remove the stench quickly and efficiently, men with buckets, carts, and rope. Still, the pace was slow, and the effort patchwork. While one city hired official night soil teams, another continued to rely on freelance cesspit diggers paid in beer or bread. In some places, like 15th century Lübeck or Ghent, rudimentary sewage channels began to appear. Narrow, shallow, often open to the air, but a step forward nonetheless. In Florence, city engineers repurposed parts of ancient Roman sewers, restoring and expanding them with stone slabs and drainage grates. Italian city-states, in particular, preserved fragments of classical knowledge, and their urban infrastructure reflected it. Some even designated civic funds for sewer maintenance, with workers paid salaries, not just per job. In southern Europe, especially within monastic communities, the tradition of controlled water usage never entirely died. Cistercian monasteries maintained disciplined sanitation through running water diverted from nearby streams into separate buildings called reredouters, latrines often constructed over flowing channels that carried waste away without human handling. Though primarily for monks, these systems stood as rare islands of engineered cleanliness in a continent drowning in filth. In Central Europe, the story was more chaotic. German towns like Nuremberg and Cologne enacted strict waste regulations but struggled to enforce them. Cleaners still operated at night. Waste was often dumped in forest clearings or marshy ground, despite efforts to centralize disposal. The word Abortgrube, meaning waste pit, became synonymous not just with cesspools, but with hidden, dangerous places where men vanished. Despite city efforts, the cleaners' world remained dark and brutal. In England, particularly after the Black Death, some city councils attempted to integrate cleaners more formally. In London, the title of gong farmer became a recognized role, tied to defined hours, routes, and pay. Contracts were awarded annually. Cleaners could appeal to magistrates for unpaid wages or protection from violence. But even here, reform was limited. They still worked only at night, still lived at the edge of society, still disappeared without trace if something went wrong beneath the city's surface. In France, the situation was a patchwork of extremes. In Paris, waste removal slowly evolved into a semi-organized civic function, with records kept of cesspit cleaning schedules, street dredging, and latrine locations. But in smaller towns, waste was still thrown from windows with a shouted warning. Cleaners worked unlicensed, unregulated, and entirely at their own risk. One man might work under contract for a bishop. Another might vanish in a pit behind a butcher's stall, unpaid and unmourned. What all regions shared, however, was the enduring paradox. The cleaner's work became more vital with each passing decade, even as his social standing remained unchanged. The cleaner enabled urban life itself, He kept the streets passable, the water drinkable, the homes livable. But as long as the filth was hidden, so was he. Progress did not bring respect. Even when wages increased and contracts formalized, the job was still seen as a curse. Yet, in subtle ways, the very presence of a system, even a broken one, began to mark a transformation. When city clerks logged cesspit locations, they gave the work structure. When councils fined those who dumped waste illegally, they gave it boundaries. When engineers laid channels to guide filth away from wells, they gave it direction. And when these fragile systems failed, they gave the cleaner something he never had before: proof, documentation, a record that he had been there, that someone had been paid, that something had been cleaned. It was not salvation, but it was the first step toward a different world. By the close of the 15th century, Europe had not yet escaped its filth, but the cities were changing, slowly, unevenly, and not without resistance. And in the shadows, the cleaners kept working, dragging their carts through narrower streets, lowering their buckets into deeper pits, their hands still raw, their backs still bent, but no longer entirely forgotten. The world had begun to realize what happened when they stopped. Today, we flush and forget. We press a button, hear the rush of water, and turn away, never thinking, never touching, never smelling. Waste vanishes in an instant, swept into unseen pipes that coil beneath our feet like veins beneath skin. It feels automatic, natural. Cleanliness seems to flow from the walls, endless, effortless. But none of this came easily. None of it appeared by accident. Beneath every shining tile and porcelain basin lies a legacy written not in marble, but in blood, disease, filth, and silence. The medieval toilet cleaner lived in a world without this luxury. A world where waste stayed where it fell, where it built up like sediment in the body of the city, threatening to choke it from the inside out. And the only thing that prevented that collapse, day after day, century after century, was the unthinkable labor of the most despised men alive. They had no tools of precision, no machines, no protection. They stood in waste that reached their waists, inhaled fumes that ate at their lungs, handled disease with bare hands. Their pain was unacknowledged. Their death was unrecorded. But they made urban life possible. Every street that didn't overflow with sewage, every well that didn't turn black with decay, every house that stayed standing on its foundation was the result of someone descending into a pit, unseen, unloved, and pulling the filth away by hand. And what is more chilling, more shameful, is that even today, their labor has not ended. Over 3 billion people around the world still live without access to safe, private toilets. In slums, refugee camps, rural villages, and collapsing cities, men and women still climb into pits and scoop waste with buckets. They still breathe the same poisoned air, still suffer the same skin infections, still cough through the night, still die young. The same work, the same danger, the same stigma. Only now, it happens far away from the world's gaze, hidden behind barbed wire or in alleyways no tourist will walk. The technologies exist, the knowledge exists, but the will, political, social, human, often does not. And so the work continues. Sanitation workers, often untrained and unprotected, are lowered into septic tanks without gear. Some drown, some suffocate, and when they die, their families receive no compensation, no recognition, no change in circumstance. The city simply hires another, and in the safe world, the world with tile floors and scented candles and pristine bathrooms, we never notice. We believe ourselves clean because we are distant from the dirt. We believe ourselves advanced because the waste disappears. But the truth is not in the absence of filth. It is in the hands that carry it away. If there is any moral to the story of the medieval toilet cleaner, it is not that humanity is cruel, though it is, nor that suffering goes unrewarded, though it often does. It is that our comfort has always depended on someone else's torment, that every stage of progress, every layer of modern life, is built on the backs of people who were broken to make it possible. The marble of empires rests on the labor of invisible men. We are taught to admire the architects, the kings, the thinkers, but we rarely speak of the ones who kept the city from drowning. The ones who worked when the streets were silent, who smelled of rot and smoke, who were told they were unclean and believed it, who lived alone, died anonymously, and left behind nothing but a hole in the ground, and a street above it that could be walked on safely for one more day. In a world where a flush has become forgettable, it's easy to overlook the centuries of darkness, danger, and suffering that made that convenience possible. The lives of medieval toilet cleaners were disgusting, brutal, and short, but their work laid the hidden foundation for modern civilization. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.